So you have something that's been improperly scaled. And you're like, okay, so all this is nice, but I started my character. I don't want to start a new one. What do I do with my character? There is a very, very simple way to change the units that something has been built with, in the sense that, first of all, the simplest thing you could do is be like, okay, so this character that I have, let me load both here again. So this character that I have, let's say that, I think an example we had last week, someone mentioned that, Zach, I think it was you. Like you had a character that was 60 units tall. You were exporting your character art out to Marvel's Designer, and your character was about 60 units tall or something like that. And you're like, well, what's up with that? The first thing you can do, the simplest way you can adjust potential scale issues is to simply take the transpose line and measure, let's say, the height of the character. And let's say this winds up being 60 units. It's 180 right now, but let's say it's 60 units. Well, the simple thing you can do is just do a bit of math to change the scale value within your export tab so that it becomes at whatever scale you need it to be to reach the height that you want your character to be at. So, okay, you want a character to be 180 units tall, but when you're measuring it with a transpose line, your character is 60 units tall, then you just need to multiply that whatever scale value you currently have within your export, you just need to multiply it by 3, Right now, my scale value is set to 90. If I divide it by 3, now my character is 60 units tall. And if I was to export this out, so on and so forth, we could test it out. We're not going to do that again, but you can trust me with that. Your character is going to be 60 units tall. Okay, let's start with scale in Zbrush. So here is what you need to understand about scale in Zbrush. How does Zbrush deal with scale? Let's really dissect that completely. This is a very common thing that comes back when I look at student work, when I look at people who do mentorships, when I look at some of you who post me questions and ask for feedback there. This is something that comes back a lot, issues with how Zbrush deals with scale and how that gets exported to other softwares. You're not to blame for this. ZBrush is very obscure when it comes to scale. I'll start by really just starting to talk about how ZBrush deals with scale in an internal way. And then we'll move on to look into how that applies to things like primitives and more simple objects within ZBrush. It's going to be fairly abstract in the beginning there, but after we're done with that, we'll actually move on and really look at the issue of scale within ZBrush in a very practical context. And I want to move in that direction because I think it's really important to really understand how does ZBrush really actually deal with scale internally. Yeah, so we'll really look at the issue of scale in a very practical context. And so that I really want to make sure that you all have the tools at your disposal so that whatever kind of model you are working on, whether it's a character, whether it's a prop, whether it's an environment piece, whether you're working on head, whether you're working on a full body there, you really have all the knowledge at your disposal that you need to be able to make sure that you're always working at a proper scale and make sure that whatever it is that you're doing within ZBrush will be able to be exported properly to other softwares afterward, whether that's Maya, whether that's a game engine, whether that's Marvelous Designer, and that you can make sure that your scale will always be proper and you won't have any issues there. So let's start by really simply understanding and really explaining how ZBrush deals with scale in an internal way. You all know at this point that ZBrush is not a true 3D program, and so it is what we call a 2.5D program. Now, there isn't a lot of those around, but ZBrush is one of those. It started its life as more of a drawing program, and then it kind of became a 3D sculpting program afterward. And so ZBrush doesn't really have internally a concept of centimeters or inches or meters. It's just units. That's just what they are. They're just one type of generic unit, and that's it. So in a way, the good thing about that is that because there is a generic unit within ZBrush, because ZBrush deals only in that sense, that generic unit can be whatever it is that you want. Whether you want to work in centimeters, ZBrush units are going to be that. whether you want to work in millimeters because you're working with figurines and things that are 3D printed, a ZBrush generic unit can be that as well. If you're American, these can be inches if you want, although I don't necessarily recommend it, and so on and so forth there. That kind of generic unit does give us a lot of flexibility in how we decide to approach the topic of units within ZBrush, but it also makes it also a bit confusing, especially if we're changing units throughout a production for some reason. Maybe you started in centimeters and then afterward you want to see what it's going to look like in millimeters because you want to export that out and 3D print something, then that can make it a bit confusing. But you'll see that if you really understand the topic of units deep enough within ZBrush, you can usually change only one value somewhere, and you can easily convert something that is in centimeters to millimeters or centimeters to inches, and you don't have to worry about what's going to happen afterward. It's always going to work great when it's exported to its target engine there or program afterward. So internally within ZBrush, if we start by just taking a primitive and we just look at it, we can already start to deduce a few things from that. If I take here a cylinder, let's say, and I just apply that on the canvas there, I press T to go into edit mode, and then I'll press Shift P to look at the grid. So there's a few things that already kind of become apparent just by looking at that, and especially if we also start to introduce the transpose line in there, like I assume most of you will already be familiar with that, but if you're not, you press WER on your keyboard, and then you press Y so that you can have access to this little transpose line. Of course, you need to convert your object to Polymesh 3D. And so it's this kind of line, right? And this is a ruler, so you can use this to measure the size of something within ZBrush. That's what it does. And so when I take this particular cylinder here and I look on the top left of the screen, ZBrush tells me that this particular cylinder is 2 units wide right now. That's essentially the diameter of it. And if we measure the height of it using the transpose line again, same thing. It still is 2 units wide. If instead we use something else, let's say we use a cube, and we measure the size of it using the transpose line, well, let's convert it to Polymesh once more here, of course. Same thing happens. It's 2 units tall, it's 2 units wide, so it's 2 units in every direction. And that's true for all the primitives that are in here. You can even take some weird stuff like the Gear 3D and be like, okay, so how wide is this? Well, same thing. We measure the width of it, and we're still at 2 units there, or very, very close to that there. So all the primitives of ZBrush are all included within the same bounding box that is 2 units in size, essentially, on each axis there. And ZBrush has been programmed so that this particular size of object is the most optimal size to work on. For me, a question that's very interesting is, okay, so why is it 2 units wide? Okay, so I could understand people are programming something, they're using the concept of generic units. Maybe they'll make something that's 1 unit wide, right? That feels like that should be very simple, like why have we gone from 1, which should be the standard if we kind of think about it, to 2? Where does the 2 come from? And now, I'm not on the programming team of ZBrush, but the way that I kind of understand it intuitively, and I think this makes a lot of sense, right? Is that if you think of an axis, it goes from 0 to 1. And so if you were to fill if you were to take that 0 to 1 space, right, and you fill that with a cube, let's say, or a square, that square would be 1 unit across. But the problem is that if you did a box that went from 0 to 1, then that box wouldn't be centered in the world. It would be offset from the center of the world there. So essentially, if you go from 0 to 1 on the positive x, and you also go from 0 to -1 on the negative x, then you wind up with a box that is 2 units wide, but it is also centered within the world. Now, of course, you could be like, yeah, they should have gone from 0 to 0.5 and 0 to minus 0.5, but whatever, that's not how it's going on here, But so for me, that kind of idea of things are 2 units wide, it makes sense because you want the 0 to be centered there. And what you have to understand is that ZBrush has been programmed in a way with this in mind. There are a lot of tools within ZBrush, there are a lot of functions within ZBrush that are scale dependent. So I'm thinking of things like the dynamic brushes, where the brush size will be adjusted based on, like the brush size will become smaller if you're further away from a character. The brush size is going to become bigger as you get closer to the character there. Essentially, the brush size is based upon not a real world unit, but a unit within ZBrush there. That's essentially what happens there. And so these brushes, these dynamic brushes, they depend upon ZBrush having a very consistent scale across different objects for it to work properly. If you take something like Dynamesh, that's another one of these resolution or size-dependent tools, if you will. So Dynamesh is also something that depends upon an object being at a proper scale for it to work properly. You may have encountered issues where you will, let's say you're working on a head or you're working on something else, and you put your Dynamesh value very, very low. Like the lowest you can go, I think the slider goes down to 16, but I think if you write the value, you can even go lower than that. I'm not quite sure about that, but it at least goes down all the way to 16, right? So you put a slider all the way down to 16 and you Dynamesh your object and it winds up being humongously dense and you're like, well, what's going on here, That is an object whose size is simply completely way off this particular box that we're looking at right now. The size of it is completely off. This is very easy to test. We can test this out very, very simply, right? So we take this particular box here, right? And then we go into, let's Polymesh 3D. I already have one here. So we go within Dynamesh, right? And we look at this resolution slider that we have. Let's put this blur value all the way down to 0. And what happens here is that if I take this resolution slider and I put it all the way down to its minimum, so it's 8 here that we can put as a minimum here for our Dynamesh there. If I turn on Dynamesh on this particular cube and we look at the wireframe, we can actually count the number of subdivisions that the Dynamesh has done in this particular cube. And it becomes very interesting when we do that. So first of all, let's find the center, right, of our grid, which is about here. And let me turn off perspective. Let's just look at it this way, right? So starting from this particular loop, which is perfectly aligned with the grid here, with the center here of the grid, we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in that direction. And we can count 8 in the other direction as well. So the resolution of your Dynamesh is the number of times ZBrush will take that 0 to 1 box and will divide it. So it's a fraction, essentially. The resolution of the Dynamesh isn't dependent upon the size of the object as much as it is dependent upon the size of the scene, if you see what I mean, which in this case is actually dictated by this grid that we have here on the bottom there. So what happens is that if I take this particular box here that I have and I scale it up, so let's just do that here. Let's just scale it up here really, really big, right? What happens now is that if I re-Dynamesh it, now I made a value of 32 for my resolution, but my mesh is now a lot denser than it was before. I can scale it up even more. And then I can do my re-Dynamesh again. And every time I'm scaling this box up, this value of 32 of a resolution doesn't change because it's based upon the size of the scene or size of the tool, I suppose. In a way, it's not based on the size of the subtool. Like the subtool that you're working on right now can be as big as you want it to be, but that resolution will always be based upon that initial value of 0 to 1 space, if you will, that we had to begin with, which is shown to us by this particular grid that's here. Now, I believe that the grid by default, the spacing between the grid is 0.5, if I'm not mistaken there, if we scale this back down. But you can already see how having a value, having a scale of an object that's completely out of whack will throw ZBrush's tools out of whack as well, for the ones at the very least who are scale dependent there. So there is something here that has to be understood for you to have tools that really work properly for you. And so this is true for whatever object that you have in there. And not only that, but you may already be familiar with something within ZBrush, which is called Unify. And you may have been wondering, so what the hell does Unify do? Why is that even there, you know? Well, that Unify function that we have within ZBrush is meant to bring whatever object that you currently have, if it's completely out of scale, if it's too small, if it's too big, the Unify function within ZBrush, its role is to take an object and fit it within that ideal bounding box that ZBrush wants it to fit within so that it works in an optimal way. So here I've just completely scaled up this particular cube. And of interest, if you go down here, so in our geometry tab, we can actually go down here within size. And if you take a look at this here, you can actually see the size of the bounding box that the object currently fits within there. So we actually used to be at 2, as you can see. So with a little bit of imprecision, because I've been pushing and pulling on it a little bit there. And as this scales up, this value of size goes up as well. So this value of size is the size of the bounding box that the object is included in. Now, you could be wondering what happens if I actually play around with these values. Well, you're essentially going to stretch the bounding box. And it's going to either stretch or compress whatever is included within that. And the value here, so there's an X, Y, Z size, and then there's separate X, Y, and Z sliders. The value here, the X, Y, Z size, the one that's on top, is the value of the longest axis for the bounding box, which for me is always the best way to go about making sure that something is fits within that bounding box or not. You know, most things that we work aren't perfectly square, of course. If you're working on a character is very tall usually, as opposed to wide or deep. So that XYZ size will always give you essentially the height of the character in ZBrush generic units, essentially. And so enter that Unify function that ZBrush has, which is really there so that whatever it is that you have selected, if its scale is out of whack versus what ZBrush wants it to be, it will scale it back down within that nice little bounding box. So you can find Unify under deformation. If you just go in here, it's the top one. So it shows you how important they think this particular function really is. And so if we're looking at the size of this, which is 14 centimeters at its widest point right now, or 14 units, and we unify it, what happens now? We're back down to 2. Now our box has been scaled down so that it fits within a bounding box of 2. If this is smaller and we unify, now it scales it back up. So this unify function is actually quite important. It will scale whatever it is that you have so that it is at an optimal scale for how ZBrush likes to work, so that tools like Dynamesh, your dynamic brushes, these sorts of things, they all work properly. That's what it is there for. Okay, so now you know one of the tools that is at your disposal to essentially correct a particular scaling issue you could have with one of the characters that you have. Now you could be like, yeah, okay, but this is still a box, so how do we really apply this in the context of real life? And also, perhaps more importantly, your next question may be, okay, but I'm not always working with things that are 2 units wide. Sometimes I'm working on a head, and a head is, about 15 centimeters wide or so. At its widest point. I have a character that's about 180 centimeters tall, so these things don't neatly fit within a little 0 to 1 or 0 to 2 or whatever, a box that is 2 units wide, right? Well, that is why ZBrush has a scale value. If you go within your tool palette and you go down at the bottom within that little export tab that became a lot simpler using the newest version of ZBrush there, you still have this value of scale here and you have these offset values. And we'll really talk about all of these, of course, and we'll certainly talk about them in the context of a character there. But that is where this value here, this scale value, becomes important. This particular scale value is a multiplier to multiply the generic units to give you whatever units you want it to be, or whatever size of object you want it to be. For example, let's say that I'm starting to work on a head, okay? So I'm starting from a sphere, and I say, okay, I'm going to sculpt the head based off of that. Let me get a sphere here. So you take that, you convert it to a Dynamesh at whichever resolution you want, and then you start to sculpt something out of that. Okay, so sooner or later, you're like, okay, so I want to be able to use anthropometrical measurements. I want to be able to really use that as a sanity check, make sure that I'm not making a head that's too wide, that's too thin, these sorts of things. Obviously, I can't have a head that is 2 centimeters wide. That doesn't make much sense, right? So we said that a head should be about 15 centimeters wide. So you're like, I need to go from 2 to 15, right? So 15 divided by 2 is 7.5. That is where this scale value comes in. This is just a multiplier to help you out work at a scale that is proper for you. So if I take the transpose line again and I measure the size of this particular sphere, we are at 2 units wide right now, which is what we are expecting it to be. But if I take this particular scale value right here, and by the way, if it's set to 0, it just means that it's never been initialized. So Zbrush has nothing to base itself off of to know what value this should be at. But you can safely take this particular value and set it to 7.5. And now if we measure the width of this again, and we look at the top left, now we finally have a head that is 15 centimeters wide. And this will help you if you are working in Zbrush to use things like anthropometry to make sure that you are working at a proper scale with your head. So that's a great sanity check. If ever you're not really sure about your proportions, you want to kind of double check it and have a bit of an objective way to make sure that you're working at a proper scale. That's where anthropometry becomes very important. But also, this affects the mesh after it's going to have been exported, you know? Because although internally, our object still fits within a bounding box of 2 units, as is displayed here by our XYZ size within our geometry tab. Our transpose line still tells us that our head, in this case, is 15 centimeters wide. And so the question becomes, so what happens if I export this out then? Will it be 2 units wide? Will it be 15 units wide? And I've said before that that will essentially make it 15 units across. So this particular scale value is not just for modifying how your transpose line works. It would also modify how something will be exported as a scale. So we can try this out here very, very simply here. I have Maya that's open right here. Let's take this here. Let's export it out. This is a sphere. Let's go to desktop. Let's call it, I don't know. I've used this joke before. I know I shouldn't recycle jokes. And then let's go to Maya. Let's import. And let's measure how big this actually is. So let's make a sphere in this particular case. There we go. So this sphere will also actually be 2 units wide, if I'm not mistaken, within Maya. So you can already see that my little smiley sphere is bigger than that. But of course, we can go here within our p-sphere here and say we want our radius to be 7.5, which will give us a diameter of 15 centimeters wide, of course, 7.5, and there you go. Perfect fit. So this particular scale value, it's obscure within Zbrush. It's kind of hidden all the way at the bottom of the export tab, but it is one of the most important values that you have in there, you know? And you need to know how it works to make sure that whatever it is that you are exporting winds up being at the proper scale afterward. You know, if I modified this, set this back down to 1, which was its default value. I mean, the default value was 0, but 0 just means you can kind of look at it as 1, really. I know the math there doesn't quite work, but you know, if you see 0 in this particular case, you can assume that it's 1. It just means that the scale has not been either set manually to something, or you've never imported something within Zbrush that it can use as a scale reference. So it doesn't know what it's set it to, you know. But if I set this back to 1 and I export it again, just for the sake of it, here we'll call it scale 1. Go back in here, import. And there you go. Our smiley is now 1 unit wide, or actually that would be 2 because it's a radius in this particular case, but we wind up essentially having, we're back at our default value of 2 for the scale there. But so we can modify this particular scale value to whichever size it is that we want, so that ZBrush will scale its object, or rather so that we can work at whatever unit that we want, at whatever size we want, without breaking that kind of very fragile internal relationship that ZBrush has with objects, where it really wants things to fit within 2 units of a bounding box there. So yeah, you know, if you're exporting something out and you're not winding up having the proper scale in whichever software you want afterward, first of all, check your transpose line. Check how wide something is or how tall something is. First, start by checking whether this value makes sense. If this value doesn't make sense that you have here on the top left, then after export, it's going to be at whatever scale you're going to see here. You know, so if you expect a character to be 180 centimeters tall, first of all, take the transpose line, measure the height of the character, make sure that you're getting 180 units tall, first of all. But second of all, to make sure that you're really working at a proper scale within ZBrush, at a scale that will really be very nice to work at, make sure that this particular scale value that you have in here afterward is at about half of the widest axis of that imaginary bounding box that your object or your character fits within. Let's look in the context of a character to see what this looks like. So let me go here and load my character that I will probably never ever finish, even though I would really like to, but I'm always finding reasons not to work on it. So my ball tier fan art. So in the context of a character, what does this look like? Then we'll look at a head too, but let's go through a character first. What does a properly scaled character within ZBrush look like? Now, if you also have the question, which is, okay, so let's say, you know, am I going to talk about what happens if you don't have a properly scaled character, but you want to update it to a scaled character? And the answer is yes, I will also talk about that. So I'll give you a tool there that works better than the Unify tool, because the Unify tool, it works well for simple objects, but the moment that you start to have layers and morph targets and all that stuff there, like the Unify will easily just screw up everything there. So it's better not to rely upon it for complex stuff there. So yes, I will also tell you what to do in where you have issues with a full character and you want to rectify that. Okay, so in the context of a properly scaled character then, what does that mean? Well, it means that my not ball tier anymore, yet still strangely looks like him. If I measure the height of it using my transpose line, he is 180 centimeters tall, which is more or less the average there. It's what I want it to go, but it's a pretty good number to base yourself off of. Okay. So 180 units tall using my transpose line. But if I look and I go down here within our geometry tab, and I look here, you can see that my XYZ size is, it's not 2, but it's 1 right now. So he is essentially 1, close to 1 for the Y size, so that vertical size there. And so, sure, that's not 2, but that's close enough, you know. Like, it's not important for ZBrush that you are exactly on 2, you know, because your Dynamesh resolution won't change that much between 1, 2, or 3, or 4, you know. But what's important is that you don't wind up having a value of 0.1 or 10 or 20 in there, you know. Like, you need to be within the same order of amplitude, essentially, as 2 there. So this is a very, very good size, you know. So internally, my ball tier character has a size of 1 unit, but my transpose line tells me that I have about 180 units there. And if we scroll down then, and we look at what value we have within our export tab, we have a value here of about 90, which you take 180 divided by 2, you end up having 90. So this is the scale that my character needs to be so that it is, 1, at the proper scale to work within ZBrush, and number 2, so that it can afterward export properly at the size that I want him to be afterward, right? I just have to take the head, let's say, export it out. Not even sure how I called it. I literally named it 5 seconds ago. Did someone post a cat picture? That must be what just happened. Where's our head? Our head is here, if we look at our scene, right? If I take a box, I put a box, I say I want this box to be 180 tall. Boom. There you go. Here's a ruler. I can take that. The ball here is 180 centimeters tall. So I'm not going to have any problems. If I was to export something here to Mars Designer to use as part of an avatar, that would be fine as well. So everything is good here. Okay, within ZBrush, one way that you can make sure that, like very, very quickly, make sure that you are working at a proper scale or that you are within the proper ballpark there. You have a tool like this and has a lot of different pieces and it's very complex. You can just do back and forth between one of the primitives of ZBrush and your current tool. And if they roughly fit within the same box, as you can see that they're doing right now, then you're at the proper scale. What about these offset values then? What do they mean? Why are they there and what do they represent? So we're starting to understand what is the relationship here between scale and the bounding box of our object and what that represents. What about those offset values and why are they there and what are they used for? So let's go back using our default cube here, okay? And so we should expect this value to be 0 right now in terms of scale. Our size here within our geometry tab is set to 2, but within our export tab here, our scale is set to 0 because it hasn't been initialized to something. If I was to import an OBJ in this, by the way, if you're like this is weird, well, if you just import something in here, like a head in this case, you can see that now it's been set to something here. So scale is ZBrush like, yeah, let's set this to 15. It's like, all right, whatever. So this changes when you import something within ZBrush or you manually set this to something. Anyway, let's set this to 1 so that it's less confusing. So our offset values are all at 0 right now. And our cube is set to 2 units wide. So let's export this out. Let's call this cube. Let's go to Maya. Let's import the cube. All right. So our cube, if we look at it, the center of the cube, the center of that bounding box, that imaginary bounding box that we've been talking about, is at the center of the world right now within the Maya scene. And that's what that offset value represents. That XYZ offset represents the offset of the center of this bounding box in relation to another 3D program, because you can't really easily see that when you're within ZBrush. But it is important because if you're like, well, I actually want this cube to rest neatly on the ground plane, then that's where these values of offset become important. Let's say you want the character or the cube to rest neatly on the ground plane. What you would do, you would set your Y offset value to 1. So let's do that. Let's re-export this out. Let's go in here, erase that, import. Our box is neatly resting on the ground. So Y010, what does that represent? Well, it's the offset that is applied to that bounding box in relation to the ZBrush unit scale. Not the scale that you're using with your transpose line, but the internal scale that ZBrush has that we are talking about here. So if you really think about it, if this box is 2 units tall and you offset it vertically by 1, its center will go, or rather the piece that will be meeting the center of the world in Maya, if you will stop being here and will now be here because we've raised the cube by a unit of 1. So that's what these offset values represent. Same thing if I give an X offset of 1, let's say, export this out just for good measure here, still going there. But yeah, so here we go. So now this is like that. Okay, so once again, in the context of a character, what does that mean? Well, for a perfectly kind of set up character, say that we take our ball here again. If you look within my export tab, I still have a Y value of 1. Oh, that's a heavy one. I guess I won't complete it just for the sake of it, but I think you know where I'm going with this. If that XYZ offset was still set to 0, 0, 0, Balthier would have his pelvis going through the floor, essentially. Whereas by setting these values to 0, 1, 0, now I'm setting, I want Balthier to be raised by 1 unit. If you start with a bounding box that is 2 units tall, then it means that his feet would be nicely on the ground. I know it gets a bit confusing, but those values don't necessarily have to be like exactly perfectly 0, 1, 0. But the idea is that if you have issues with your object somehow being somewhere else in the scene, when you import it within Maya, but in ZBrush, it seems to be at the center. Check those scale values, okay? Because if you're working on a character that is symmetrical, then there's no reason for the X value to be anything other than 0. The Y value should be somewhere around 1 if your character is scaled properly. And your X should also probably be somewhere around 0 if you want the character to be not further towards the front or towards the back than where the scene is, you know? So that's kind of the idea there. So you have something that's been improperly scaled. And you're like, okay, so all this is nice, but I started my character. I don't want to start a new one. What do I do with my character? There is a very, very simple way to change the units that something has been built with, you know, in the sense that, first of all, you know, the simplest thing you could do is be like, okay, so this character that I have, let me load both here again. So this character that I have, let's say that, you know, like, I think an example we had last week, someone mentioned that, Zach, I think it was you. Like you had a character that was 60 units tall. You were exporting your character art out to Mark's Designer, and your character was about 60 units tall or something like that. And you're like, well, what's up with that? You know, well, you know, the first thing you can do, the simplest way you can adjust potential scale issues is to simply take the transpose line and measure, let's say, the height of the character. And let's say this winds up being 60 units. It's 180 right now, but let's say it's 60 units. Well, the simple thing you can do is just do a bit of math to change the scale value within your export tab so that it becomes at whatever scale you need it to be to reach the height that you want your character to be at, you know? So, okay, you want a character to be 180 units tall, but when you're measuring it with a transpose line, your character is 60 units tall, then you just need to multiply that whatever scale value you currently have within your export. You just need to multiply it by 3, you know? Right now, my scale value is set to 90. If I divide it by 3, now my character is 60 units tall. And if I was to export this out, you know, so on and so forth, we could test it out. We're not going to do that again, but you can trust me with that. Your character is going to be 60 units tall. But okay, so, you know, there really are 2 scale considerations, right? There is the scale at which you export it out, which, you know, this is a fairly straightforward way to fix that. But a second scale issue you could have is your character, your head, whatever it is that you're working on, isn't at the proper scale for ZBrush's tool to work properly. Because we've seen that the Dynamesh, dynamic resolution, panel loops, there's a bunch of different things that are scale dependent in a way within ZBrush. So that may also be a problem. And that's not that complicated to fix. There's just a few more steps you need to do. It's actually very simple to do that. Okay, so let's say that, let's say, for example, okay, let's say that I have a cube. And this cube, I will scale it down until it's very, very small, like that. And let me just move it on the side a little bit there. So we can see where they are in relation here, where my cube is in relation to the character there. So regardless of like the offset value and all of that, let's say that for some reason I'm like, okay, this cube, I want it to be properly scaled, but also have the size of the character, if that makes any sense. So I want this cube to be as tall as what the character is. So this is a bit of a metaphor, but you can encounter that in a lot of different cases. You know, you have a character that's 60 units tall, and you're like, I want to work with this character set to 180 units, but I also want it to be at the proper scale for ZBrush's tool to work. So let's say that this is my character. I want essentially this box to become 180 units tall. That's what it winds up being here. So let me place it back in the middle of my scene. So here's what you do, okay? You take your transpose line, once again, you measure the height of your character, or whatever it is that you want to rescale. You look at the value that you have right now for your transpose line, and right now I have a value of 0.09. So first of all, you do the same thing as we've said previously. You will change your scale value within your export tab to be at whatever value you need it to be so that your transpose line winds up being as high as it needs to be. So in this case here, let's boost this scale value here. Let's measure our transpose line. We're set to 22 centimeters here. My export value is 247, so it's completely out of whack right now. Let me still make that a lot bigger here. And I'm 140 units tall right now. That's good. Let's keep going up a little bit. 204. Now, of course, you could do some exact maths if you want to have this, if you want to have an exact value here. Okay, so I have a scale value here of almost 2,000, and my box using transpose line is now 180 units tall. Great. Okay, fantastic. Of course, you shouldn't have a scale value of 2,000. So obviously, although we've fixed the export scale, if I was to export this out, our box would be 180 centimeters tall. Internally, this still isn't properly scaled. To continue working. So here's what we do about this. You'll see it's super simple. Let's save this out as a tool. Let's save this out somewhere. So we'll call this needs to be rescaled, let's say. I'm saving this out as a Z tool on my desktop. So the foolproof way is that afterward, you simply go, you take another tool. This can be just a box you have imported. It can be another character. You could start from an empty scene if you wanted to and just have a cylinder 3D converted. You could take a cylinder here, do a polymesh 3D, go to your export, set this to 90. And now your cylinder is 180 units tall, let's say. And so what you do, you simply go afterward to Z plugin. You go to Subtool Master. You go to multi-append. And you select your Z tool that you have saved out. And you can see now my box that was at a scale that was completely out of whack is now at a proper scale here. If I try it with Baltier here, you'll see the same thing. If I go back, Z plugin, Subtool Master, multi-append, take this box, load it in here. My box is also now at the proper scale there. So I could continue working on this box at the proper scale. If you invert this, okay? Because maybe this is confusing because I started with a box and I appended it to a character, and you probably want to do the opposite there. If I was to invert this, right? So you take a character right now, 180 units tall. I want him to be 2,000 units tall. I'll figure out what is the scale value I need to set so that he winds up being 2,000 units tall. Which in this case would be a scale value of about 1,000. I save this out as a Z tool somewhere. I take a cube 3D, I convert it as a polymesh. I will also make sure that this box now is 2,000 units tall by, again, changing my scale value, which in this case would be 1,000. Was about what I had before because, well, my character was properly scaled, but you can imagine that these values would be wildly different if your character was not properly scaled to begin with. So now my box is 2,000 units tall. I can confirm using the transpose line. I go to Z plugin, multi-append, select the Z tool I have saved of my character, open it, and what it's going to do, it's simply going to merge your subtool, or all your subtools within that tool that you have that is properly scaled. So that's how you fix ZBrush scaling issues. Now, I assume this is a lot to take in, okay? We've gone through a lot of things. We've talked about Unify, we've talked about the size, we've talked about the bounding box, Dynamesh resolution, improperly scaled characters. It took us a while to go through this because I really wanted to dissect everything really to its smallest important component so that you know what happens in whichever situation in which you want to adjust the scale of something. If something is improperly scaled, if you want to change the units, okay, if you have a character that's in centimeters, you want to export it out as millimeters, it's simple. You just have to multiply by 10 that scale value. And your character will now suddenly be in millimeters. If you want to convert from centimeters to inches, you divide by 2.54, I believe. And so with some basic maths, you can rescale something, and you don't have to go through like complicated plugins. I know that there is Scale Master as a plugin that's there, but ultimately Scale Master just does whatever we're doing right now. Sure, it's a bit more user-friendly, but it's also kind of, if you kind of over-rely on that, you don't quite understand how it works internally, you can also kind of get into a bit of trouble because you may wind up having stuff that's improperly scaled and you're not sure how to get out of that. So I hope that understanding this at a very deep level really helps you make sure that you really avoid having scale issues in the future, or at the very least, that you know how to fix scale issues that you may have.